On the surface, the Lewis family looked like a picture-perfect slice of black middle-class success. A well-paid software engineer, a driven marketing manager, and a home that always sounded warm whenever relatives stopped by. But the closer you looked, the easier it became to see the truth. Each person in that house was walking a completely different path, tied together only by a silent secret waiting for the right moment to explode. Adrian Lewis had spent his entire life becoming the man his family expected him to be. Steady, polite, responsible, and respectable. He knew that role too well. So while he could perform it without thinking, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, even the way he touched his wife, it was all part of a script he'd rehearsed for years. Beneath that mask, though, lived a fear he had learned to bury since he was a teenager. A fear of being seen as who he truly was, a fear of disappointing his family, a fear of being judged by the world around him. He built his entire life on silence, on safe choices, on a marriage created not out of love, but out of the terror of being found out. To everyone else, Adrian was dependable. On the inside, he was a man quietly suffocating. Simone Lewis was a different story. She didn't live in fear. She lived in longing. Longing for affection, for connection, for the kind of intimacy every married woman hopes for. Simone entered marriage with high expectations, a loving home, 2 thriving careers, mutual respect, and a partnership that felt like a team. But what she got instead were half-hearted hugs, polite forehead kisses, and dinner conversations filled with silence, while Adrian drifted off into thoughts she was never allowed to know. She didn't understand why her husband kept her at arm's length, but each passing year carved a deeper wound inside her. Simone did everything she could to keep the home warm, but she was the person who felt the cold the most. Then there was Jalen Brooks. At just 17, Jalen was the only one in the family who lived unapologetically free, proud, open, expressive, and unafraid to be exactly who he was. He came to stay with his uncle and aunt, hoping for a break after a painful breakup, completely unaware that his presence would stir up everything buried beneath the surface. Jalen was a mirror, reflecting all the things Adrian once wanted for himself, but never dared to reach for. At the same time, his confidence and light-hearted energy only magnified the emptiness Simone felt in her marriage. 3 people, 3 paths, 3 different kinds of loneliness. And between them, a house that looked peaceful from the outside, but was filled with things left unsaid. None of them knew it yet, but it would take only one spark, one moment of crossing a line, for everything they were hiding to erupt into a tragedy they could never undo. And once the gears of fate began to turn, all 3 of them had already stepped too far from the point of no return. Adrian Lewis had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. To anyone looking in from the outside, he was the kind of man people quietly admired. Smart, successful, stable, the one who always had his life neatly arranged. But beneath that carefully curated exterior lived a man who had spent his entire existence performing, shaping himself into whatever others needed him to be. Adrian didn't just wear a mask. He built his entire identity around it. Growing up in a family where vulnerability was treated like a flaw, Adrian learned early that survival meant silence. His parents believed in success, discipline, and appearances, always appearances. In their home, emotions were something to be folded neatly and put away like laundry. Adrian was praised for being quiet, obedient, and focused. He took those compliments as instructions and carried them through life. When he realized he was attracted to other boys, he understood instinctively that this truth had no place in the life expected of him. So he buried it deeply, painfully, and perfectly. By high school, he had become an expert at compartmentalizing. He dated girls he never truly connected with, excelled in academics because achievement was easier than self-acceptance, and built a personality that looked right from every angle. In college, when others were experimenting and discovering themselves, Adrian doubled down on responsibility. He saw self-discovery as a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, he chased stability, good grades, internships, recommendations, anything that kept people seeing him the way he needed them to. When he entered the tech industry, he found a place where structure could hide chaos. Coding gave him a sense of control. Algorithms didn't judge. Computers didn't question identity. And long work hours gave him an excuse to avoid anything that threatened the mask he wore. The more successful he became, the easier it was to convince himself that he was doing the right thing, that pretending was safer than living honestly. Then came Simone, a woman warm enough to soften any room, successful enough to impress his parents, and charismatic enough to charm everyone around her. Adrian didn't fall in love with her the way a husband should. He fell for the idea she represented: normalcy, acceptance, protection. Marrying her wasn't an act of romance. It was an act of survival. She was the final piece of his disguise, the shield that made the world believe he was exactly who he pretended to be. But masks are heavy, and Adrian carried his for a decade. Year after year, the guilt grew, not just for lying to Simone, but for lying to himself. Her attempts to connect with him, light touches, late-night conversations, moments of vulnerability, felt like gentle knocks on a door he couldn't bring himself to open. Every time he turned away from her, a part of him cracked. He knew he was hurting her, but he also knew that dropping the mask would destroy everything he had built to protect himself. The loneliness that came from hiding who he truly was didn't just sit quietly inside him. It grew roots. It settled in his chest, wrapped around his ribs, and made breathing feel like work. Adrian learned how to smile without warmth, speak without feeling, and live without living. He thought he could maintain the facade forever. That time would numb the parts of him he refused to acknowledge. Then Jalen arrived. In the presence of a 17-year-old who lived openly and unapologetically, Adrian saw everything he had denied himself. Jalen was freedom, pure, unfiltered freedom. And for the first time in his life, Adrian felt his mask slipping. He wasn't prepared for the jealousy, the admiration, or the longing that followed. Jalen didn't just unsettle him. He forced Adrian to confront the truth he had buried for decades. Adrian's life had been a long, exhausting performance. And once the mask finally cracked, there was no way to put it back on again. Simone Lewis had always believed she understood what love was supposed to feel like. Growing up in a modest but disciplined household in Chicago, she was taught early that hard work, ambition, and self-respect were the pillars of a good life. But she also carried a quiet longing for connection. She dreamed of a partner who would see her, really see her, and appreciate the fire she carried inside. By the time she met Adrian, she was already a rising name in marketing, admired for her confidence and warmth. To everyone around her, she seemed to have the magic touch, intelligent, charming, and steady. Yet beneath that polished exterior lived a woman who carried the weight of wanting more than the world ever gave her. When Simone first encountered Adrian, she mistook his gentleness for depth. He was calm, stable, and attentive in a way that felt refreshing compared to the flashy men who often gravitated toward her. Adrian didn't crowd her with ego or pressure. He listened. He spoke softly. He watched her with an admiration that felt genuine. In those early months, Simone allowed herself to believe she had finally found a partner who would match her loyalty and effort. She didn't realize then that he admired her not because he loved her, but because she was the final piece in the life he wanted others to believe he lived. Simone entered the marriage with her heart wide open. She decorated their home with warmth, filled their weekends with plans, cooked dinners, lit candles, and created a life she assumed they would build together. But the deeper she leaned in, the further Adrian seemed to drift. He was affectionate, but carefully, like he was performing a role rather than sharing a life. She tried to ignore the quiet ache inside her, the nagging sense that something was wrong. She convinced herself that all marriages went through slow seasons, that love wasn't always a burning fire, but sometimes just steady embers. Yet the embers never warmed her. Adrian's excuses became routine. Long nights at work, stress, deadlines, fatigue. Simone tried to understand, but every gentle rejection chipped away at her confidence. Each time he pulled away when she reached for him in bed, each time he avoided her touch, each time he stared past her during dinner, It felt like she was living with a shadow instead of a husband. She spent years wondering what she lacked. Was she not beautiful enough? Not exciting enough? What was she missing? In her quiet desperation, she sought comfort where she never planned to. A co-worker's flirtation turned into a kiss, and that kiss, after years of feeling invisible, felt like oxygen to someone who had been suffocating. Simone hated herself afterward, but the emptiness at home didn't fade. Instead, it grew sharper. One lapse turned into another. She wasn't searching for love. She was searching for proof she was still worth wanting. She never imagined the consequences those moments would carry. Simone tried to shield Adrian from her own guilt, all while battling anger toward him. Anger he never understood because he never knew the truth. She didn't want to leave the marriage. She wanted him to finally look at her the way a husband should. She wanted the life she built in her head, the partnership she had promised herself. But instead, she was forced to accept a lonely reality. She was married to a man who touched her out of obligation, loved her out of convenience, and lived beside her without ever truly being with her. When she caught Adrian with Jalen, the truth hit her with a brutality she never saw coming. All the years of feeling unseen suddenly made sense, and the cruelty of that realization shattered something inside her. She wasn't just hurt. She felt humiliated, erased, made a fool of in her own home. And worse, she had unknowingly played a part in a chain of events that would destroy all three of their lives. Simone wasn't born a villain. She was a woman who wanted to be loved, but spent a decade living in her husband's shadow. The darkness that grew inside her wasn't hatred. It was the twisted reflection of a heart starved for affection for far too long. Jalen Brooks stepped into the world with a kind of confidence most adults spend their entire lives trying to earn. At just 17, he carried himself with an energy that felt fresh, unapologetic, and unmistakably his. Jalen didn't just know who he was, he embraced it. Growing up in a household where self-expression was celebrated instead of suppressed, he learned early that his voice mattered, his identity mattered, and his feelings deserved space. His mother had always told him, "People gonna judge you no matter what, baby. So you might as well give him something real to look at." And Jalen lived by that. He came out at 14, not because he planned to, but because hiding felt unnatural to him. His mother hugged him so tight he couldn't breathe, and his older siblings rolled their eyes and said, "We already knew." His home wasn't perfect, but it was solid where it counted. Jalen never had to mask himself, never had to ask permission to be the person he was becoming. That kind of freedom shaped him, made him bold, expressive, and unafraid of taking up space. He wore bright colors, laughed too loud, posted selfies that half his school talked about, and refused to shrink himself to fit anyone's comfort. But Jalen wasn't immune to heartbreak. His recent breakup, his first real one, left him restless, questioning his worth, even if he would never admit it out loud. His mother suggested he spend a few weeks with his uncle Adrian, someone she respected deeply. She thought Adrian's discipline and success might ground Jalen, help him focus on school again, maybe even inspire him. Jalen agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because he needed distance from the reminders of his ex. He walked into the Lewis household with an open heart, excited for a change of scenery. What he didn't expect was the heaviness in the air, a tension so subtle it almost felt like a draft no one else noticed. Simone greeted him with warmth, the kind that felt genuine and effortless. But Adrian was different. Polite, yes, but guarded in a way that didn't match the calm, disciplined Jalen had heard about. There was something in Adrian's eyes, something tired, restrained, maybe even haunted. Jalen couldn't pinpoint it at first. He was simply being himself, filling the room with stories about school, dating, his future plans, and the little victories and frustrations that made up his teenage life. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He didn't censor himself. And sitting across from him, Adrian watched with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something Jalen didn't understand yet. The more time they spent together, the more Jalen noticed the cracks in Adrian's mask, the way he stared too long at the floor before answering simple questions, the way he seemed both drawn to and intimidated by Jalen's confidence, the way he softened when Jalen talked about living openly. Jalen took it as a compliment. He was used to inspiring people who were still figuring themselves out. But Adrian wasn't just figuring himself out. He was unraveling. Jalen became, without meaning to, the mirror Adrian had spent his whole life avoiding. A reflection of everything Adrian wasn't allowed to be. Free, expressive, unafraid. Jalen didn't hide his identity, didn't apologize for it, and didn't flinch under anyone's expectations. For Adrian, that was both beautiful and painful to witness. The connection that developed between them wasn't planned. It wasn't even fully understood in the beginning. Jalen saw Adrian as a mentor at first, a complicated, quiet man who seemed to be carrying more weight than he let on. But as days passed, Jalen noticed the way Adrian's eyes lingered, the way his voice softened around him, and the way he tried, unsuccessfully, to hide the conflict brewing inside. Jalen didn't go to the Lewis home seeking trouble. He didn't imagine he'd become the catalyst for the collapse of an entire life. He was just a teenager trying to heal from heartbreak, trying to breathe a little easier. But sometimes, simply being yourself, simply shining in a room built on shadows, is enough to make everything fall apart. Jalen was freedom embodied. And for a man like Adrian, who had spent decades in chains, that freedom was both irresistible and devastating. Late one evening, the Lewis house felt unusually quiet, one of those silences thick enough to press against your skin. Simone had gone to bed early after a long day at work, leaving Adrian and Jalen alone in the living room with a half-finished movie playing mostly for background noise. Neither of them was paying attention. For Adrian, the television was nothing more than a distraction from a storm he had been trying to suppress for days. For Jalen, it was a silent stage on which he was becoming increasingly aware of the tension sitting between them. Adrian sat rigidly on the far end of the couch, pretending to be absorbed in the screen, though his mind was miles away. Every fiber in his body was alert to Jalen's presence beside him. The soft rustle of his clothes, the faint scent of his shampoo, the occasional brush of their arms when one shifted. Adrian hated himself for noticing, for wanting, for feeling something he had spent his entire adult life denying. He kept telling himself to breathe, to stay calm, to move, to do anything except sit in that dangerous closeness. Jalen, meanwhile, felt the shift in the air even if he didn't fully understand it yet. He wasn't naive, and he wasn't blind. He had seen the way Adrian's eyes lingered too long, the way his voice softened whenever they talked, the way his expression flickered with something unspoken whenever Jalen laughed. It wasn't predatory or creepy. If anything, it felt sad, like watching someone stare at a life they never allowed themselves to live. At first, Jalen tried to ignore it. Adrian was his uncle, and the last thing he wanted was to misinterpret something and ruin the fragile harmony in the house. But the longer he stayed, the harder it became to pretend he didn't feel that pull, that unspoken connection forming between two people who shouldn't have been looking at each other that way. The scene that changed everything started small, almost nothing. Jalen made a joke about how serious Adrian looked during the action scene. Adrian cracked the kind of rare smile that made the corner of his eyes crease softly. Jalen nudged him lightly with his elbow. "See, you do have a sense of humor," he teased. Adrian's heart jolted in a way that scared him. Jalen wasn't flirting. He was just being himself, that bright, effortless confidence that seemed to pour out of him without warning. But for Adrian, who had spent decades hiding, Jalen's authenticity wasn't just attractive. It was intoxicating. Trying to escape his own thoughts, Adrian stood abruptly. "I think I'm going to head to bed," he said, his voice uneven. He took a step toward the hallway, hoping distance would save him from himself. But Jalen reached out and gently grabbed his wrist. "Adrian," he said, no uncle, no buffer, just his name spoken quietly in a room where everything else felt unbearably loud. Adrian froze. Jalen looked up at him with a calmness that made the moment even more dangerous. There was no judgment in his eyes, no confusion, just a quiet understanding that settled between them like a truth neither of them had the strength to deny. "You don't have to pretend around me," Jalen said softly. The words hit Adrian harder than any confession. His throat tightened. He swallowed, shaking his head weakly. I don't know what you're talking about. But he did. They both did. Jalen let go of his wrist slowly, almost reluctantly. Okay, he murmured, even though his expression showed he didn't believe the lie for a second. Adrian should have walked away. He knew that. He should have gone into his room, closed the door, and prayed the moment would dissolve into nothing by morning. But he didn't move. And Jalen didn't look away. The silence turned electric. Two people caught in the gravity of a decision they weren't supposed to make. Adrian took one step back toward Jalen, then another, as if pulled by something neither of them could control. Jalen didn't reach for him, but he didn't move away either. His breathing slowed. His eyes softened. When Adrian finally leaned in, it wasn't fast or impulsive. It was hesitant, trembling, like a man stepping across a line he'd been staring at his entire life. Their lips touched, just lightly at first. Jalen inhaled sharply, but didn't pull away. In that instant, the world outside the living room ceased to exist. There was no marriage, no family, no consequences, only the overwhelming relief of being seen and wanted, even if only for a moment. What started as a single forbidden kiss unfolded into something neither of them could stop. It was reckless, dangerous, and undeniably wrong, but it felt inevitable, like two lives colliding after years of moving in opposite directions. By the time they realized how far they had fallen, it was already too late. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. Simone hadn't planned to come home early that evening. She had stopped by the grocery store, picked up a few things for dinner, and decided on a whim to take the shortcut instead of her usual route. It was one of those small, random choices that feel insignificant in the moment, but end up detonating a life. As she walked into the house, she noticed the unusual quiet. The living room lights were still on. She heard faint murmurs coming from the hallway, soft, breathless, intimate. At first, she assumed Adrian was on a work call, or maybe Jalen was listening to music. But then she heard something else. A hushed laugh. A whisper. A sound she recognized but hadn't heard from her husband in years. Her pulse quickened as she followed the noise toward the guest room. She pushed the door open, and the world stopped. There, in the same bed she had made up just days before, were Adrian and Jalen. Startled, half undressed, frozen mid-movement like two thieves caught in the beam of a spotlight. For one long, horrifying second, none of them spoke. The shock was too sharp, too massive, too unbelievable to fit into words. It was Simone who broke first. Her scream wasn't loud. It was guttural, torn straight from the deepest place inside her. Adrian, what are you doing? Her voice cracked, trembling with fury, humiliation, heartbreak, and disbelief all at once. Adrian scrambled to his feet, stammering, his hands up as if he could physically protect himself from what she had just witnessed. Jalen looked away, choking on a mixture of guilt and shame that hit him hard and fast. Simone's eyes flooded, her whole body shaking. With him, she spit out, pointing at Jalen. Your own nephew. Adrian tried to reach for her, but she jerked back violently, as if his touch were poison. Let me explain. Explain what? She shouted. Explain why you've rejected me for 10 years? Why you married me when you didn't even want me? Why you touched me like it was an obligation? Why you've treated me like I'm invisible? Her voice broke. Is this the reason? Has this always been the reason? Adrian's mask, his lifelong disguise, finally shattered. He didn't have the strength to lie anymore. Simone, he said, voice barely more than a whisper, I'm gay. I always have been. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It roared. Simone staggered back as if struck. Jalen, feeling sick, mumbled an apology and slipped out of the room. But nothing he said, or didn't say, could undo the destruction now unfolding. For days afterward, the house was a battlefield of silence. Simone avoided Adrian entirely. Adrian tried to talk but could barely look at himself, much less her. And Jalen, drowning in guilt, packed his bags and returned home, taking the secret with him but carrying the shame like a weight strapped to his chest. The real nightmare began weeks later. Jalen fell ill first. Fever, fatigue, drastic weight loss. His mother rushed him to the hospital, and the diagnosis came swiftly, brutally: HIV positive. The news hit Jalen like a truck. He hadn't been with anyone else. He knew exactly where it came from. Elijah tested next, and his results mirrored Jalen's. The ground dropped out from under Adrian. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't out sleeping around. He wasn't even living honestly. There was only one possible source: Simone. The few times Adrian had forced himself into marital intimacy, the nights Simone thought were breakthroughs but were really acts of performance, had unknowingly carried a deadly cost. Simone, stunned, took the test too. Her results were HIV positive. The truth hit all three of them at once. Simone had contracted HIV from one of her own affairs. She had unknowingly passed it to Adrian. Adrian had unknowingly passed it to Jalen. It was a chain of hidden pain, secret betrayals, and quiet desperation linking three people who should have been family. For Adrian, it was the final blow. The mask he wore had not only ruined his life, but had destroyed the lives of the two people who least deserved it. For Jalen, it was a permanent reminder of a moment he wished he could erase. For Simone, the guilt quickly twisted into something darker, heavier, more dangerous than either man could have imagined. And this was only the beginning of the tragedy that was about to unfold. Simone had always thought of herself as a survivor, strong, capable, the kind of woman who could rebuild her life no matter what storm came her way. But after the night she caught Adrian and Jalen together, something inside her cracked in a way she couldn't repair. At first, it was heartbreak, then humiliation, then rage so sharp it felt like electricity under her skin. But when the HIV diagnosis hit, when she realized she had unknowingly infected her husband and that infection had traveled from him to Jalen, the emotional dam inside her finally burst. She wasn't just angry anymore. She felt poisoned by shame. For days, Simone drifted around the house like a shadow. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. She replayed her entire marriage in her mind. Every cold night, every rejected touch, every moment Adrian looked through her instead of at her. The betrayal felt endless. She had been giving everything while he had been hiding everything. And the worst part was realizing that even in her darkest moments, she still wanted answers. Why didn't he trust her? Why didn't he leave? Why did he let her believe she was the problem? Adrian, racked with guilt, tried to approach her gently, offering apologies that sounded like broken glass in the silence between them. But Simone no longer heard regret. She heard cowardice. She saw a man who had spent their entire marriage pretending, allowing her to carry the weight of his lie. And now, because of all those lies, she had played an accidental role in a tragedy that would haunt her forever. The guilt festered into fury. Simone began to feel like she had been living in a prison built by Adrian's secrets. Suddenly, her humiliation wasn't enough. She felt robbed. Robbed of a real marriage. Robbed of trust. Robbed of the life she had poured her heart into. And Adrian still moved through the house like someone waiting to be forgiven. That only made it worse. She didn't want forgiveness. She wanted justice, or what her unraveling mind convinced her was justice. The idea didn't come to her all at once. It crept in quietly, the way anger sometimes feels like clarity. She caught herself imagining him gone, imagining silence instead of pain, freedom instead of shame. At first, she shook the thought away, horrified, but the thought kept returning, more vivid each time. Soon, she wasn't horrified anymore. She was curious. Simone started researching in the quiet hours of the night. At first, it was subtle, symptoms of poisoning, natural causes of sudden illness. But curiosity quickly shifted into intent. How to poison without detection. Arsenic symptoms. How long does arsenic stay in the bloodstream? Late-night searches turned into deep dives into forums, articles, and case studies. The more she read, the calmer she felt. It was as if she had found a task to drown out everything else. The idea transformed from an impulse into a plan. Arsenic seemed perfect, odorless, tasteless, slow. It could mimic stress, food poisoning, even organ failure. And best of all, it didn't require anything suspicious. Just a simple trip to a hardware store a few towns over, disguised as someone shopping for pest control. She drove there on a Saturday afternoon, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap. Her hands didn't even shake as she picked the product off the shelf. She paid in cash. No small talk. No hesitation. Back home, she hid the container behind old paint cans in the garage. She waited 2 days. Watched Adrian come home tired from work. Watched him rub his temples. Watched him slip further into the guilt that was eating him alive. Every moment only convinced her more. He deserved to feel what she had felt. He deserved to suffer. The first dose went into his wine, just a small amount, enough to weaken him. He thanked her for dinner that night. Simone smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had given in weeks, though not for the reasons he thought. Over the next several days, she mixed small amounts into his meals. Adrian began feeling sick, nausea, fatigue, stomach pain. Simone feigned concern, offering tea, blankets, gentle touches. She played the devoted wife he never allowed her to be. Inside, she felt a twisted sense of power. For the first time, she was the one controlling the narrative. As Adrian grew sicker, Simone told herself she wasn't a monster. She was simply delivering the consequences he had forced her to bear. All the lies, all the secrecy, all the pain, he had created this path. She was just walking it. But the line between victim and killer had already been crossed, and Simone was no longer looking back. When Adrian Lewis collapsed in the kitchen one quiet Sunday morning, Simone thought she was ready for it, for the chaos, the sirens, the questions. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind over and over. But when the paramedics rushed through the door and pronounced him dead, something inside her shifted unexpectedly. She didn't feel relief. She didn't feel victory. Just a hollow silence, as if her anger had burned so hot it left her numb. But the silence didn't last long. At the hospital, the attending physician noted inconsistencies. Adrian's symptoms, weeks of nausea, abdominal pain, unexplained weakness, didn't fit with sudden collapse or natural causes. Protocol demanded a toxicology test. Simone didn't know that. Or maybe she had convinced herself she was smarter than protocol. Either way, the test results changed everything. Arsenic. Once that word entered the report, everything moved fast. The police department assigned Detective Carla Monroe, known for her sharp instincts and refusal to overlook even the smallest detail. She approached the case politely at first. No accusations, just questions. But her eyes were always observing, measuring, evaluating. Carla walked through the Lewis house with a trained calm. The kitchen was spotless, too spotless. The garage, however, held a clue Simone never expected anyone to find: a cheap pest control container with residue that didn't match its label. Carla didn't accuse Simone on the spot, but that discovery was the first domino to fall. Digital forensics handled the next. A search through Simone's phone and laptop revealed late-night online queries that read like a confession in plain text. How to poison without detection. Arsenic symptoms timeline. Where to buy arsenic. Each search was time-stamped. Each timestamp matched the period leading up to Adrian's sickness. When Simone was brought in for questioning, she initially tried to maintain her composure. She repeated the same lines. Adrian had been stressed, overworked, not eating well. She didn't know what happened. She was devastated. But Detective Monroe was patient, brutally patient. She let Simone talk until the inconsistencies began revealing themselves naturally. Carla didn't interrupt. She didn't rush. She simply presented the evidence: the container, the searches, the toxicology, and the testimony from neighbors who had noticed tension between the couple. Simone's facade cracked, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a building slowly collapsing into dust. Her confession started as a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go this far, but the more she spoke, the more the truth spilled out in disjointed pieces. Anger, heartbreak, betrayal, guilt, and a pain that had rotted into something much darker. By the time she finished, there was no denial left, no justification strong enough to erase what she had done. Her trial became a spectacle. Reporters filled the courtroom. Headlines branded her: wife turned killer, HIV tragedy, forbidden affair gone deadly. The prosecution presented Simone as calculating, a woman who planned, researched, purchased, and executed a slow, deliberate murder. The defense tried to paint her as a victim whose emotional breakdown pushed her to a moment of catastrophic despair. But the jury didn't need much time. The verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Sentence: 25 years in prison. Simone's shoulders slumped when the decision was read. Not in defiance, and not in protest. Her exhaustion finally showed. She had spent so long clinging to rage that she had nothing left to hold. Jalen Brooks did not attend the trial. He couldn't bring himself to revisit what had already destroyed him. He was living with HIV now, managing his health, trying to piece together a future from the fragments of a mistake he would regret for the rest of his life. Some nights he hated Adrian. Other nights he missed the only person who had ever seen the parts of him he didn't show the world. But mostly, he just wanted to forget. Adrian's family struggled to reconcile the tragedy. A son who hid his truth until it consumed him. A wife who weaponized her pain. A nephew caught in the crossfire. There are no heroes in the story, just victims of silence, shame, and secrets. In the end, everyone wondered the same question. Who destroyed who? Was Adrian the one who set the tragedy in motion by living a life built on lies? Was Jalen the spark that cracked open a house already filled with gasoline? Or was Simone the one who turned pain into revenge, crossing a line that could never be uncrossed? The answer wasn't simple. Tragedies rarely are. But the legacy of the Lewis family became a haunting reminder. Secrets don't stay buried. They grow roots. And eventually, they consume everything around them.